Thank you, sir. I'm very pleased to reflect on some of the contributions that were made during the estimates process, and given that I covered a number of ministers, I'm also grateful to the Shadow Treasurer for enabling me to take the administrative position that gives me a bit more time to do so in this speech. During the estimates process, I had the privilege of spending time on behalf of the opposition and the people of South Australia, putting to a range of ministers detailed questions in their portfolio areas of matters that were in the budget. In particular, I spoke to the Deputy Premier, the Minister for Higher Education in relation to the Universities Review, the Minister for Tourism and Multicultural Affairs about those portfolio issues, which are not my portfolios, but the Honourable Jing Lee, as she sits in another house, has asked me to be entrusted with looking after those matters for the opposition. The Minister for the Arts, we spent some time on the Tuesday of estimates, and then the Honourable the Minister for Education, Training and Skills had the pleasure of each other's company for about 6.5 hours on Wednesday. I thank the Deputy Speaker for his chairmanship of those committees, which I thought was done in a high quality this year, and I thank the ministers who were at almost all times courteous, who took very few dixes by comparison to previous years. On this front, at least, I think there has been some positive use of the process, and there were some answers found. So, I'd like to start on that happy and pleasant note, sir. Unfortunately, some of the issues that were identified were more concerning, and particularly in relation to the use of South Australian taxpayer funds by this government and the poor priorities and poor decisions that they've been making. And I propose to go through a number of those portfolio issues that particularly came up in the estimates to highlight a summary of the reflection on the document as we seek to note them today. In relation to the Deputy Premier, the majority of the questions, though not all the questions that I had for her, were in relation to the government's handling of the university merger process. The government came to office with an election promise to set up a university commission which would explore the benefits, potential opportunities of a university merger, what sort of merger would be appropriate for South Australia, what that would look like, how it might be achieved for the best interests of the people of South Australia. The day before the estimates process questions happened, the Deputy Premier, the Premier and the Vice-Chancellors of the Universities of Adelaide and South Australia outlined an entirely different process to the election commitment, a proposal for a university merger between those two universities, negotiated behind closed doors with the government, with the investment of $440 million of South Australian taxpayer funds. And so, obviously, the following day was the first opportunity to probe in detail, as much as was possible, the Deputy Premier about the detail of how that was being rolled out. I was really disappointed by some of the answers we got, and I don't want to go through every issue that was raised, but I'll highlight a couple of issues. One of the principles of good government is that the government, acting on behalf of the people of South Australia, would take into consideration their interests, the costs and risks that would go alongside the benefits and opportunities of any project prior to making a decision. And what became very clear through the Deputy Premier's evidence, and has become more clear in the weeks subsequent, has been that that work wasn't done by the government in relation to this decision. Now, I'm not preempting whether or not it's a good decision or not. There's a committee investigating that. The Liberal Party will go through its own process. We are open-minded, sir, about whether it was a good decision. But what was clear is that the government process was deeply, deeply flawed. And I'll highlight one thing. The business case, it's been described also as the feasibility study, but effectively the university has described it as a business case, a risk register. All of that work that was considered by the university councils in helping them make their decision on whether this was a good idea for their institutions, that was not read by the Premier or the Deputy Premier, as became very clear through this estimates process prior to the government making the decision to proceed with this plan, this investment of nearly $500 million in South Australia's money, taxpayers' money. And we'll get to talking about the money, but perhaps even more importantly than the money, the consequences of the decision for the future of South Australia. Now, if the opportunities are realised in full and we can have confidence that they will be fully realised to the extent that it has been claimed, then that's a potentially good thing. If indeed the financial and economic benefits to South Australians and the new university is more than the sum of its parts, then that's potentially a good thing. If critically the student experience and the vocational outcomes of students who have undertaken study at the new potential future university, or the Adelaide University as it's to be called, if their student experience and their learning is of a higher quality than can be delivered at either of the existing institutions were they to continue, then that would be a good outcome. And it has been put to us by the Premier and the Deputy Premier that this is a foregone conclusion. But good governance would require somebody to at least explore whether the assumptions they're making are accurate. It's not as if this was an election promise, that there will be a merger come hell or high water the people of South Australia have voted on, and that's the scrutiny process. No, because that wasn't the election promise. The election promise was for there to be a Universities Commission to do that very work, to explore those opportunities, and critically alongside those opportunities, the risks that have been in the public domain for some time now, the risks that the general experience of the student experience and vocational outcomes at larger institutions is less good than those at smaller institutions. Now, that's not in every case, and certainly Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy, and I commend him for his work at the University of Queensland, he cites that as an example of where the opposite is true, but it has certainly been put as a risk, one worth considering. It has been put as a risk that while ultimately scale may well, and not everyone agrees, but certainly let's accept that scale were to lead to improved opportunities for research funding and potentially improved, therefore, rankings in the international rankings in the long term. Under any scenario, it's suggested that there's going to be transition pains and transition cost. And the question is whether that transition cost, over whether it's 5 or 10 or 15 years, before you get to that optimal outcome in the 2030s for the university, is that transition cost worth more than the benefits? The universities say no, and that's certainly their view from their point of view. But it's the responsibility of good government to make the decision on behalf of South Australia's point of view. We don't just take the word of third parties when the request comes in to support them financially with $440 million without doing due diligence. The due diligence in this case that we're asked to accept is that the Premier and the Deputy Premier's word is enough. During estimates, I asked the Deputy Premier, has the Minister read the business case that was prepared by the universities in relation to informing their decision to proceed with the merger? The Deputy Premier said, look, there are a number of items of documentation that I think could be referred to. There's a feasibility study, as I understand it, whether it is the business case, feasibility study, whatever the title is, that went to the two councils that contains all of the case and a significant amount of commercial and confidence material. I have not received that full document. Later on, we explored this further. I asked, has anyone in government been provided with that business case? The Minister said it was a document that was provided to the councils because they have a fiduciary duty to make a decision about what is in the interests of their institution. So it's quite likely that it would have material that was shaped for the purpose of considering each individual university's future, and they may not have been the same document. The answer is no, if anyone was unclear. Later I put it to the Minister to put it more clearly. The business cases the universities provided to their councils were to work out whether they considered it as being in their interest to proceed. The government's job is to work out whether it is in the interest of the South Australia to proceed. It is a different question. And the Deputy Premier a little later said exactly, and I think you've made the point I was seeking to make earlier. So the Deputy Premier and I were on the same page to an extent, but the page is really worth questioning. The point that was being made is that the university councils, and I have absolute confidence in good faith with lots of information that has not been released to the public, have made a decision that's in their interest to merge on the basis of the $440 million in government funding. But what impact does that decision, that government decision, not the university's decision, but the government decision, what impact does that have on Flinders University if one institution is to get funded and the other is not? What impact does that have on local communities in the eastern and northeastern suburbs of South Australia who are going to be dramatically impacted if the land currently used as the McGill campus is to be sold for what is it to be sold for? The government hasn't even said. But certainly development having impacts on amenity, on traffic, on infrastructure and lifestyle in those areas, and areas that have been subject to the most significant urban infill of potentially any part of Adelaide that's not a greenfield site over the last 10 years, particularly as a result of the John Rao planning era. Those impacts are dramatic. But then we get back to the significant issue, the issue that, thankfully, the Parliament in its wisdom has seen fit to establish an inquiry with wise parliamentarians such as yourself, sir, to explore all of that work that should have been done by the government prior to the commitment of $440 million, of whether it is in the state's best interests, whether the risks have been considered, and if necessary, mitigation strategies put in place to avert the outcomes of those risks, not just for the government's investment, but for the thing itself, of whether the question is, the very question that is this merger in the best interests of South Australia? Because when you take away existing institutions that are training, giving university qualifications to more of our professionals, our teachers, our medical professionals, our scientists, our engineers, than any other institutions. That's also the output of the university, not just profit that they make or how many international students they can bring in to cross-subsidised research as has been put. It's actually also an extraordinary piece of human capital that comes out of these institutions. Professor Lloyd and Professor Hoy are highly regarded, well-respected and deeply intelligent, deep thinkers in Australia's university scene. That is not in question. And they've made a decision that's in their university's interests to proceed down this path with this government investment. But this estimates procedure, this estimates hearing, made it very, very clear the responsibility that is on all of us as legislators as we're considering a bill that apparently will be coming any day now from the government as to whether it's in the state's best interests. And we should all take an open mind to that and seek out the evidence, and the evidence thus far hasn't been provided, but I thank the universities for their acknowledgement that there will be more information to come. I look forward to seeing it. Also during the estimate session with higher education, the Deputy Premier and I discussed issues relating to government commitments on scholarships, and indeed those scholarships that were promised by the government at the last election that are now starting to be rolled out. We have high hopes that they will indeed attract more people to the teaching profession, for one. There is a significant level of need for more teachers in our system, and that is going to be exacerbated. That challenge will be exacerbated. That opportunity potentially will be exacerbated by the decision of the government to proceed with the Royal Commission's recommendations in relation to 3-year-old preschool. And that model and the modelling done by the Royal Commission suggests that our shortfall at the moment is about 140 teachers in early childhood alone. There's also many, many teachers required in country areas and schools across South Australia and hundreds more. In addition to that current shortfall, and that current shortfall of hundreds more non-teaching qualified staff to meet the needs of 3-year-old preschool, there is also a requirement of 880 more diploma and certificate qualified staff, 120 directors and other staff, and another 660 teachers. We're talking about a need for more than 2,000 extra teachers over the next 3 years to meet the government's election commitment in an area where in the earlier childhood education space, we currently have 2,000 early childhood teachers in South Australia. The government has set itself a task, and indeed, I think the several dozen scholarships in question may help. I wish them well. In relation to the arts portfolio, we had an interesting hour, and I thank again Minister Michaels for taking very few dixes and being engaged in the questions that were being asked. There were several issues that were of importance. The first issue I want to raise in relation to the arts estimates is that of the APY Arts Collective and indeed the review that the Minister for Arts has over them at the moment in conjunction with her colleagues in the Northern Territory and the Commonwealth. The APY Arts Collective reflects a number of local arts centres in the APY lands, artists from the community. These artists include some extraordinary artists. These artists are people who have lived their life in the APY lands, who have grown up there and who are telling their stories. They're at an extraordinary quality that is sought after around the world. Artists from the APY Arts Collective include the most recent winner of the Ramsay Prize, and that is something to be celebrated. But unfortunately, many of these artists, despite their significant achievements, have told me, have told the member for Hyson, have told other people that they feel a stigma over their work is because of the review that is continuing on, and has, as a result of question time today, we learn no end date, potentially the end of the year, and that's really concerning to them. It's concerning for their livelihoods while this stigma is over their heads, because exhibitions have been cancelled both in Australia and abroad. And it's not to put too fine a point on it, it's their livelihoods, it's their well-being, it's their way of earning money. And that money is reinvested in those APY communities. And it's while their exhibitions are cancelled, and while people are not looking at their works in exhibition, not buying their works, that source of funding to that community, that non-welfare funding that has been making its way in recent years to those communities has dried up. Now, as the Minister for Arts said in question time today, these issues are important. And it's important that if there's a review that it be correctly done. But it's worth noting that the National Gallery undertook a review into the works that they had in their exhibition, and that review was able to be auspiced, terms of reference drawn up, reviewers appointed, the review conducted, the review reported on, all in about the same time that it took this government to figure out who was going to be on their review committee for their review. The National Gallery finished its review in the time that it took this government to get its review started. And that's extraordinary when there are livelihoods at risk, and particularly livelihoods that support vulnerable communities. The strong message I give the government is to get on with it. Have a look at the National Gallery review and consider whether there are opportunities to reduce the scope of the current review in accordance with the fact that the National Gallery has already done a lot of the work, certainly in relation to some of that background. I think that the well-being of artists is a strong consideration, and in the estimates process we discussed this with the Minister. At that point, the Minister had not yet even concluded the appointment process for the review panel. But I made the point, obviously I suspect our most significant concern is for the artists, and the Minister said absolutely, and I continued on their well-being. Can I ask the Minister what role the government plans to play in supporting those APY artists through what is at the moment a difficult time, I expect, to fulfil their commercial potential moving forward? And the Minister said, once the panel is stood up, I'll be guided by and work with them as to what departmental support we can provide, particularly to those artists. What you've touched on is absolutely key, being able to support them to tell their story, be able to support them going forward. A lot of these art centres will continue with or without the APY Arts Centre Collective. Some incredible work is being done at those art centres. They are members of the APY Arts Centre Collective, but they are individual art centres, largely on their own, so they will continue. We just need to make sure we have the right support for these people to help them through it. And those are worthy statements. The Minister says we want to support the artists who, as I've pointed out, are significantly affected and emotionally affected and financially affected, as are their communities. The Minister said they wanted to support them. The Minister said that once the reviewer stood up, she'll engage with the review in her department to see how they can be supported. And do you know what's happened since then? The department has sent a letter to the APY Arts Collective cancelling their funding. We find out today in question time it's a legal mechanism designed to enable the funding to be cancelled straight away rather than having to be waiting 6 months if the review finds wrongdoing. And if the review doesn't find wrongdoing, as the NGA review found no wrongdoing, then presumably the department will send back a letter saying, oh, we're okay with the reinstating the funding now. They may do that. We didn't get confirmation of that today, but they may do that. Certainly encourage them to. the key thing in here that's been lost is the well-being of the artists, because the minister said in estimates that well-being of the artists was the primary concern and that the government would be looking at ways of supporting them. And in talking to some of the artists about this question a couple of weeks ago, a good start might be a telephone call. Listening to the artists, talking to the artists about what they need and how they can be supported. It's all very well to say that you are listening to the voices of Aboriginal South Australians, but when you have a significant issue like this that's having a practical and dramatic impact on the welfare of vulnerable people as well as younger First Nations artists, listening to those artists, I'd encourage the government would be a really good start. Also in the arts portfolio, I draw to the attention of the House some issues in relation to a topic called supplementation. It's in relation particularly to the support for non-government organisations who are supported by government with regular grants. Those grants get indexed to a point, but indeed last year's mid-year budget review, it was highlighted, of course, inflation's been dramatic, so the government increased the indexation with supplementation for a range of organisations delivering frontline services in recognition of their increased costs. However, as came out during this session of estimates, there are a number of environmental organisations and a number of arts organisations that have been considered by this government as unworthy of attracting that supplementation. We recognise that in the social services sector there are a great number of organisations that are experiencing those dramatically increased costs, and so certainly we're supportive of the supplementation that's gone to certain organisations. But for the government to pick and choose then which organisations get it and which don't, in a way that is not consistent, as I understand it, with the application of the original Treasury instruction, the application of the original funding, is most unusual. And in relation to arts organisations, it's particularly keenly sought by a number of those organisations. And so I asked the Minister about this, and it was certainly, you'd think from the Minister's answers that she was in regular dialogue with the Treasurer, regular discussion with the Treasurer and Treasury officials about getting this decision overturned, and including those arts organisations. There's about 40 arts organisations in question that deliver a service for the South Australian people supported by government funding, the successive governments having determined that it is in our well-being, our education, our cultural well-being, supporting our young people and a whole range of other reasons why we support these arts organisations. The government funds them. They've got increased costs like everyone else, and the service that they deliver is reduced at a time of cost of living crisis when they don't get support from the government equivalent to what it's meant to be. Effectively, what you're seeing if the supplementation isn't given to these groups is that it is a cut to their funding. So, as I understand it, there's about 6 organisations that have been given that supplementation funding and 30-odd that have not. The Minister said that she's seeking some flexibility and working through with Treasury as being able to expand that across those very worthy arts organisations. I asked, can the Minister advise when she expects to have an outcome from her negotiations with the Treasurer on that matter? And the Minister said, I cannot answer that, of course, it's a decision for the Treasurer. Hoping quickly, I cannot answer that definitively. I put on the record I continue to wish the Minister good luck in those negotiations, but I regret to advise that a Freedom of Information application to the Office of the Treasurer found an application seeking access to all briefings, advice, memos and/or correspondence relating to the inclusion of arts organisations in the list of NGOs supported with funding for indexation supplementation, in particular any information relating to which organisations were included in the program or not, and any related advice, and any correspondence or memos or minutes of meetings between Minister Michaels and the Treasurer in relation to indexation supplementation for NGOs, returned, and I quote from the FI officer, pursuant to section 23(1)(b) of the Act, I advise that following an extensive search conducted within this office, no documents relevant to your request were located. No documents, no meetings, no minutes of meetings, no diary entries presumably, no correspondence. It does not seem that this government takes these arts organisations seriously at all, and for all of the honeyed words of the Arts Minister in seeking to reassure the arts sector that she's on their side and seeking the Treasurer's forbearance and the Treasurer to overturn his decision, I think in this case the Treasurer is carrying the can being given the can to carry for a whole government that has no interest in supporting these arts organisations. I think those arts organisations and their spokespeople see through that hypocrisy, and I think that they will continue to lobby and advocate their cause articulately, passionately, and frankly they deserve better than just being taken for granted. Their costs have gone up. What they offer to our community in terms of helping our young people in their creativity, in terms of helping our community stay in touch with culture, to experience art and what it can offer us through performing arts and visual arts, music and dance and everything else. These organisations are really, really struggling at the moment, and the government is doing nothing to help. One of the particular election promises that the government took to the last election was that there'd be a $10 million live music fund. And during the estimates process this year, we did some exploration of how much of that $10 million live music program had been spent, how much was still going to be spent. What became very clear during the estimates is that the government thinks that its work here is done, that musicians in South Australia, music advocacy groups, live musicians, everybody who thought, yes, the new government's coming in with a $10 million live music package, well, they've been sold a pup too. Simple questions in relation to the package. Asked the Minister how it had been spent. So we had 85 event grants supporting activity at $1.5 million. There was $500,000 to the Royal Show to get live music back to the show. There was $250,000 for mental health support, and there was about $1 million redeemed in e-vouchers that were given to local venues and to support live music. That was a total of about $4 million, which some might say is less than the $10 million live music program promised by the government, to $4 million expended of the $10 million live music package, as I said. And as I said, given that the live music industry had some confidence that there would be a $10 million package one way or another, I asked the Minister if the government would consider repurposing any of the $6 million unspent towards other measures that will support the live music industry in South Australia. The Minister said, I think we were quite clear going into the election as to what that commitment was, and particularly what that $5 million was for. That $5 million obviously being kept in the Treasury Fund in case there's any more COVID lockdowns. So, absent any COVID lockdowns, the live music industry cannot expect to see any of that funding. If there are further grants available, if the money's been rolled over for that $1 million that was unspent in e-vouchers, then maybe it'll be more than $4 million. But a $4 million expenditure, when the government spent a year trying to claim credit for their $10 million package for live music in South Australia, again has been seen through by the industry. And people aren't taken for fools lightly. They don't like it. And they don't like being taken for granted, and they're not going to be taken for granted in this area without having their voices heard too. Finally, in relation to the arts portfolio, I asked a question about the Adelaide Festival Centre. Sir, it is the 50th anniversary of the Adelaide Festival Centre. This was an initiative that crossed a number of governments. It was, in fact, the Dunstan government that got to open it. It was, in fact, under Playford and Hall that the project started. But for 50 years, South Australia, through our festival centre, has had the world presenting on our stage to people in South Australia. It's been a launching pad for many careers. It's a wonderful thing to celebrate. And in its 50th anniversary, what has become clear in this 50th anniversary year, this government has supported the Adelaide Festival Centre with about $1 million worth of cuts to their programming. The loss of staff, and indeed, in terms of celebrations of the 50th anniversary, the Minister's previously talked about funding being provided to support that celebration. And I asked about that again. Is there going to be any funding to support the Festival Centre in its 50th year celebrations, and to what purpose has that funding been put, or will it be put? And we're now in 29th of August, about 2/3 of the way through the year. As yet, no extra funding. The Minister at Estimates took it on notice. It was disappointing, to say the least. Now, all of these criticisms of the government, with the possible exception of the delays to the APY Arts Collector Review, are not reflections on the Minister personally, but reflections rather on the low priority this government puts on the arts and culture sector here in South Australia. Its low prioritisation is highlighted by the fact that inasmuch as there have been commitments in the election to support the arts sector through extra funding to the Fringe and extra funding to the Film Festival to annualise it, and certainly not making any criticism of those two initiatives, the $10 million live music package, which as we've discovered has turned out to just be $4 million, those promises did not come with an asterisk on the mail that was being sent out to all of the arts organisations ahead of the election, saying, oh, by the way, this is going to be paid for out of defunding or cutting funding to other arts organisations. But that is, in effect, what has happened. And we've seen dramatic budget savings with significant impacts on a range of statutory companies and other small to medium companies and larger companies. They're feeling the effects, whether it is through significant cuts to their funding. So we've seen the Festival Centre, the museum, a range of the institutions, or even just the fact that their modest funding has not been supplemented to remotely keep in track with inflation. They're feeling it, and they don't feel like the arts cultural sector is a priority for this government. It's important when it comes to the future of young people in South Australia, for whom the arts and cultural sectors have, in South Australia, I think more than any other state over the last 50 years, have felt that South Australia is a place that nurtures their opportunities here. But under this government, no more. In relation to the education portfolio, I might make some remarks, and in particular, I'd like to comment on the reflections we had through the estimates process of how the Gonski funding process works. Because it's been identified that in the budget papers there's an increase of $381.7 million in how much the Education Department had to spend this year compared to what it was identified as in last year's budget papers. And that increase continues, I think up to nearly $500 million by the end of the forward estimates. Over the forward estimates, that chart shows about $2 billion extra in the Education Department's budget than it had in last year's budget papers over the same period. That's a dramatic increase. Now, the reason is due to, and I'm quoting here from the budget papers, due to the higher indexation applied to the schooling resource standard, base amount and loadings under the National School Reform Agreement. This is because in 2019, when I signed along with Minister Dan Tehan from the Commonwealth the Gonski Agreement setting into place that Federal Education Act, that unlocked extra funding that was going to be increased every year according to certain criteria and an index. That's been applied in this case, and so the government has $2 billion more than it thought it was going to. And that was because we wanted to have a consistent understanding in education of growth funding so that it can be applied towards getting the right outcomes for our students so that we can obviously maximise our opportunities in their lives and for our economy and for our nation. The government is currently dealing with an EB with teachers who are asking for quite a lot of extra, as we understand it, 20-25% pay rise, and an SSO in every classroom. This would be a fairly large financial commitment. I understand from media reports the Education Minister has suggested it's in the order of $1 billion a year extra, and the budget papers show Gonski provides an extra $380 million a year. So there's a gap. Under the National Agreement, currently we fund 95% of public schools' schooling resource standard. The Minister, when he was a shadow minister, argued that that should be 100, and the government needed to renegotiate Gonski with the Commonwealth so that it got up to 100. And he also criticised me as a minister for having in there a 4% of the state contribution that was able to be applied to things that weren't necessarily directly the responsibility under Gonski. So there's 9% short of what public schools should be getting, according to the Education Minister when he was in opposition, and certainly now the Education Union. And were that 9% to be restored, 5% extra from the Commonwealth and 4% extra from the state, I think we established during the estimates process that it was in the order potentially of an extra I think it was an extra $190 million per year, the minister said, if we got that extra 5%. And if the minister was to offer up an extra 4% of things that are going towards depreciation and the SACE, if that wasn't counted towards Gonski, for example, then presumably that would be an extra $150 million or so from the state government. So it's up to the minister to negotiate within Cabinet whether his rhetoric in opposition is going to be met by investment in government. But what we're talking about would then be an extra $340 million a year or so on top of the additional indexation. Would still be well short of what the teachers' union is apparently arguing for. But if the minister and the government are going to put their money where their mouth has been for the last 4 years, then that $340 million extra over and above what's in the budget might well assist the Minister for Industrial Relations in his negotiations with the union. I'll leave them out. I'll leave that there for them to explore and see whether they want to come up with their cash. We understand from the estimates hearings that the negotiations on the next round of the National School Reform Agreement and how that funding is going to be going forward is imminent. Hasn't been announced yet, so presumably that negotiation is happening at the same time as the negotiation of the EB. I have some sympathy with the Education Minister given that complication, but nevertheless he had certainly high expectations when he was in opposition, and those expectations can now be reasonably applied to him in government. The application of Gonski funding was a topic that attracted some discussion during both the estimates proceedings and since. And the application of that funding should be towards public school students and their teaching and learning. What we discovered during the estimates process was that $1.2 million of that funding has been applied not to the teaching and learning of public schools, not indeed even to the particular decisions that the government has taken into their priorities for public schooling, but instead towards advertisements, including TV advertisements for enrolments applications at the Finden's New Technical College. TV advertisements for a high school to get enrolments. Enrolments the government is seeking to achieve at Finden High School's Technical College are 120, 16 Year 10 and 16 Year 11. And that will be a supplementation to the several hundred students who are already at Finden High School. $1.2 million is a substantial campaign. The Deputy Premier, when she was the Education Minister, decided to spend about $3 million on TV ads and cinema ads for public education in about 2016-2017, and she was roundly pilloried and criticised for use of money in relation to that purpose. But $1.2 million for effectively enrolments at one school is pretty significant. The government has defended this decision on two bases. One is that they want to tell people about the technical colleges, 2 more of which will be open in 2025 and 2 more of which will be open in 2026. And they say that having a focus on these critical industries that are going to be supported by these technical colleges, it's worth it. It's important that we tell people about this. And the second basis on which they defend it is, oh, but you guys did it too. They say that $300,000 was applied towards the Building What Matters materials ahead of during the previous government, and $45,000 was applied to a campaign called Thank Ed. And those were the 2 examples cited. Now, I'm going to take the Minister's word for it. It was in a question on notice that he replied today in the Parliament, and it's in materials that the government was backgrounding and providing directly to journalists a few weeks ago, that there was a $300,000 from Gonski money in relation to the Building What Matters campaigns. I am uncertain that that's entirely accurate, but I'll take them at their word. Sure that that must be accurate because they said so. It's a much smaller number for a start. And secondly, and here's the thing, what that Building What Matters material was hoarding and bunting around schools. It was materials that had to be bought anyway because there were big buildings going up. And indeed, it was those buildings when you have an active worksite, you'll note there's always bunting and hoarding around them. We were upgrading up to, I think, in the order of 100 public schools and building 5 new schools. That's a lot of real estate to cover across the whole state as part of a $1.5 billion education building program in our public schools. Those materials, instead of having the name of the builder, had a picture of the school that was being built so that a community could have confidence in their local public school. At a price tag about $1 million less than what is proposed in this circumstance. Let's assume that it was Gonski funding. The Minister says so, so it must be true. It's still an order of magnitude less, and it was money that had to be spent anyway. It was money that was actually doing a purpose other than grandstanding over a government election commitment. The second campaign that the Minister and the government cling to as an example in defence of their Findon program was this $45,000 that went to a Thank Ed program. Context for that Thank Ed program was an encouragement for people of South Australia to thank their teachers in the middle of a pandemic when the pressures on those educators as leaders in our community was second to none in living memory. I don't know about members on the government side, but I've got pretty acute memories of the anxiety, extraordinary anxiety being felt by so many in our community during the pandemic. And as we were encouraging people to work from home for their and their community safety, we had the advice that said schools should stay open for our kids' health, and because with some mitigation in health circumstances, it was still safe to do so. So as we were telling everyone else to stay home, we were asking teachers to trust that advice in extraordinary times and go to work. And many people felt anxiety at that time, but our teachers did an amazing job. Our principals, our preschool directors, our leaders did an amazing job. We didn't think it was inappropriate to spend $45,000 expressing gratitude to us. It was actually going to have an impact on morale and connect communities in a very positive way with teachers. Because, again, I don't know if members on the government remember, but it was a febrile time, it was a difficult time, and people were sometimes behaving not at their best. So encouraging positivity in the community, something that was directly going to the benefit of our teachers and our school communities and morale in our school communities and culture in our school communities, we felt was money well spent. And at $45,000, the government's complaining about that. My goodness, how badly must they feel about the $1.3 million they've spent on the Findon Technical College campaign? So I go to the second part of the government's defence on why this money needed to be spent. And it's a defence that I think the Chief Executive repeated in Budget and Finance. I've heard the Minister reflect on similar things. And it's critically this, that if the government felt it was so important to talk about the opportunities through VET and skills and technical qualifications, I agree with them. 8 out of 10 of the fastest growing jobs that we need extra workers for in this state over the next 20 years are going to be jobs that require skilled and technical qualifications. These are jobs where a robot is unlikely to take your job. These are jobs where often the young people can do a traineeship or an apprenticeship, get paid while they're learning, and indeed have a fantastic career and go on to amazing things. They may go on to do a university degree as well. But there is a perception problem around skills and technical qualifications. And it's a challenge that particularly the research we did when we were in government identified. We need to convince students that there are opportunities there. We need to give them good career counselling. We need to get them on those positive tracks. And we need to also convince their parents that it is indeed a worthy use of their time. It's a focus for them. It's going to be something that will give their child every opportunity, because parents, as it turns out, the research shows, are often one of the main groups encouraging kids to go to university, even if that university degree isn't necessarily the most appropriate or the best path for that student. Parents understanding the benefits of skilled and technical qualifications is a worthy goal, and if the $1.3 million advertising campaign that the government put in was to convince parents, was to encourage people to think about skilled and technical qualifications, was to let people know that every public school in South Australia now offers flexible industry pathways to help young people connect with jobs, to connect with learning opportunities, and to connect with the skills that industry and business have told us that they want from their school leavers and their graduates. That would have been a worthy campaign. That would have been Gonski money well spent. That would have met the purpose of the Gonski expenditure as intended by letter and by motivation. But instead, we have a campaign that Freedom of Information documents show was designed around encouraging and stimulating enrolments at Findon Technical College, enrolments that, as of the date that enrolments were supposed to close, were about 50 of the 120 spots available. Despite the fact the Premier and the Minister have been there about 13 times doing media and telling us that the phones were ringing off the hook with parents who were desperate to be there. 50 enrolments after a $1.3 million advertising campaign is really disappointing. I've been to Findon High School a couple of times, yeah.
Order.
Thanks.
Order.
We also, what we did when we were in government was introduce flexible industry pathways at more than 100 public schools. We did a significant body of work listening to families and communities, businesses and industries about what they needed from their technical qualifications. What we didn't need was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students, including from the most elite schools in Adelaide, doing Cert 3 and fitness qualifications during the winter break to boost up their ATAR, paid for with government's training budget, as was happening every year during the former Wetherill years. And instead, we thought what would be good is if we spent training money on areas where people could get job outcomes and encouraging school-based apprentices to do jobs, to do roles that would help them into a job. And indeed, at more than 100 schools, we introduced these new flexible industry pathways that have been doing just that, and still are. This is something the government should be celebrating, because I commend the Minister, I commend the government. They've kept them. They've kept these reforms. They haven't reinstituted the old way of doing things. They've kept the new way that we put in at the beginning of 2022 in all schools after piloting it for the 2 years before. And despite the fact that every school is now a technical college in terms of the quality of the technical pathways that they offer, the government didn't advertise that and isn't advertising that to its young people. Instead, it's spending its Gonski money advertising these places, and unfortunately, not very successfully. We hope every single one of these 120 places is full at the beginning of next year. We want this project to succeed. We're in opposition that wants South Australia to do well, and we want Findon Technical College to do well. But that doesn't require $1.3 million to be spent on this one advertising campaign. FOI documents show that the decision to go to TV came with public servants expressing an interest in what the Premier thought, whether it met his expectations, and the decision was made after a meeting with the Minister and the Chief Executive. The Chief Executive has clarified in Budget and Finance that it was entirely on his recommendation, and I take him at his word. Of course, he is, I think, wrong, but to do so. But I think the government should really reconsider and not do this again, because what else could that $1.3 million have been spent on? It wasn't new money to the budget. It was money that is in the budget because of the National School Funding Agreement, which we signed in 2019. It's existing resources. That money could have gone to course counselling, the very issue that we're talking about. Those course counsellors could have been encouraging people to Findon High School, but instead the aspect of professional course counselling that was in the department's work plan when the new government came into office was cancelled. It was cancelled in order to redirect funding to government election priorities. That money could have gone into supporting work to stop little kids from being excluded and suspended from school. Little kids with disability, including Reception Year 1 and 2, were found by Professor Linda Graham to be at the highest risk, indeed hundreds and hundreds having suspensions and exclusions every year, because whether it's their classroom teacher or the structures around them aren't set up in a way to support them. So our government put $15 million towards a set of reforms to support those students better. This government, that money was to be spent over 4 years. This government kept the reforms, kept the money, but spread it over an extra 2 years, over 6 years. So those extra supports won't be in place until later. Those are the sorts of programs this government has cut or reduced or delayed in order to pay for TV ads at the Technical College. That is why I get aggravated about it, and I think that the government's defence for it have been not very good. I'm going to jump to another topic at this point. I seek leave to continue my remarks, sir.
Leave is sought as leave granted? Yes, sir. Okay. Minister, the bill to be taken into consideration?
Next day of sitting.
Next day of sitting. Is that seconded? Yes, sir. Put that those in favour say aye. Those against say no. The ayes